Luke, and I just have to give a huge thank you to everyone here. This is amazing. Just quickly scrolling through all of the different places that people are coming from. I am just so appreciative that everyone is taking the time to be here and showing their love and appreciation for this amazing place that we're in today. So I actually heard a cuckoo this morning, did not see it, while I was down on the San Pedro River, which is another one of our priority conservation areas. And I just wanted to put a tiny bit of context into this presentation and just how important Sonoita Creek and this area is. So we work on 3 major rivers, one of them being the San Pedro, another being the Santa Cruz, and Sonoita Creek also is one of our priority areas. So technically part of Santa Cruz watershed. And this area is just so unique, and we'll hear more about that shortly, but it's just a really critical area for Tucson Audubon, but also clearly everyone else here because you've shown up to learn more about it. And I was gonna go through and introduce everyone, but I'm actually gonna have each of our presenters introduce themselves in just a moment. I'll say their name and they'll give just a little bit of background on themselves. So fair warning to our presenters, just because we have so many people here, I want you to be able to find their video and know who's talking when they're each presenting. So I'm gonna start our presentation here. We're gonna listen to a little bit of sounds and then we'll go on to hearing introductions from our presenters. So just give me a quick second to start sharing my screen. Make sure I share with sound. Okay, we're gonna hear a couple of sounds from the Cuckoo Corridor here. Are we hearing those? Give me a thumbs up, Luke. Cool, thanks. This is our sound test. All right, and that was actually pretty late in the morning. So if you've been able to, be at the Paton Center, you know how amazing it is just to be immersed in all those bird calls and really feel like you've stepped into a different world, even though you're right in the middle of the town of Patagonia. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about what makes this place so special. And we have an amazing group of people to help us to do so. So let's start with Nick, if you want to unmute yourself and just give a little bit about yourself. This is Nick.
Hey everybody, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, cool. So yeah, my name is Nick Beauregard. I am a PhD student up here at Northern Arizona University. So don't ask me why I'm in Flagstaff, but when I'm studying Southeastern Arizona, it's just the way things worked out. So I'm a PhD student working on yellow-billed cuckoos in Patagonia and the Sky Islands more broadly. I'm also a biologist with the USGS, so this project I'm working on, it's a very collaborative project between USGS, US Fish and Wildlife, Tucson Audubon Society, Audubon Arizona, and a few other nonprofits and federal agencies. And we're all working collaboratively to work on cuckoo conservation and monitoring regionally. And so I'm really excited to be a part of this presentation. I'm really excited to have this many people here. I think this is going to be the biggest talk I've ever given. Usually scientific talks have about 10 people in the room. So this is great. I saw a few people are from Massachusetts and New England more broadly. That's where I'm from originally. So I'm really glad to see New England represented in this group. So yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Nick. All right, Keith, you're up next. Check that you're off mute and you're good to go.
Hi, I'm Keith Camper. I've been a birder since my teens and growing up in Michigan. And I liked all aspects of natural history, but I found out there weren't like a lot of snakes and there are herps that were around during the winter time, but birds were. So I kind of stuck with that. I moved to Arizona in the early 90s after, or I visited Southeast Arizona in the early 90s and knew I'd end up moving here. Moved here in about 2003, fell in love with the Patagonia area and visiting there at the Paton House. It was absolutely fantastic. Right now, I'm a board member at Tucson Audubon Society and just really enjoy birding in Southeast Arizona.
Awesome, thanks Keith. All right, Carrie, you're up next.
Hi, I am Carrie. I'm the Restoration Project Manager for Tucson Audubon. I've been with Tucson Audubon since 2016. I went to school for biology from ASU, and then I got my master's in Parks and Resource Management. And yeah, so for the past 4 years, we've been doing a lot of riparian restoration and urban restoration in Tucson.
Thank you. And Howard.
Hi, my name's Howard Buchanan. I'm the watershed specialist for Sonoita Creek for Tucson Audubon. I am one of those rare breeds known as an Arizona native. Shout out to all Arizona natives. I work on community development around watershed issues, specifically in the Sonoita Creek watershed. I've been working on the Sonoita Creek watershed specifically with riparian issues, hummingbirds, and riparian area assessments, monitoring, doing a lot of citizen science coordination, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how all of you respond to the good work I think everybody's going to show you here in the next few minutes.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And I'm going to put myself on mute now because I'm just going to be clicking through the presentation for everyone. But we'll all come back at the end and very much looking forward to question and answers. So we're going to get started here. This is just a quick itinerary of what we're going to cover. So make sure to enter your questions in the chat box as we go along so you don't forget them. And I'll see you on the other side.
All right, so I'll start us off here. I want to just kind of give everyone a brief overview of the region we're working in, the region we're talking about. So it seems like a lot of folks aren't from Tucson or southeastern Arizona, which is great. I really love talking to folks from away from our region about how special the Sky Islands are to me and to birds generally. Here is a map of the Southwest. The area that is in the dotted red line, starting in kind of southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, down into Sonora, Mexico. This is what we call the Madrean Archipelago. And so if you think about how the Rocky Mountains to the north are a pretty obvious geological feature, geographic feature, and the Sierra Madre to the south is also a pretty enormous and obvious geographic feature. In between these two ecoregions is this archipelago of mountain ranges that we often just call the Sky Islands. And so to the west, this kind of starts with the Babaquiviri Mountains on the Tohono O'odham Nation, moving east through the Santa Ritas and the Tucson Basin, over to the Chiricahuas and the Palancios in New Mexico. As far north as the Santa Teresa Mountains, along the Gila River, and south into almost Hermosillo in Mexico. So this archipelago really represents the confluence of a number of different ecosystems and ecotypes. So on the west, we have the Sonoran Desert influencing that western edge of the Sky Islands. To the east, we have the Chihuahuan Desert, and to some extent, even the Great Plains. To the north, we have that Rocky Mountain influence, and to the south is the Sierra Madre and the Neotropics. And so really, it's the only place in the United States where you can find such biodiversity because it's such a big confluence of several different ecosystems. And so the Sierra Madre influence in particular is really pronounced down along the borderlands in the Patagonia region. And so this is why along the Sonoita Creek corridor and the Santa Rita Mountains and the Chiricahua Mountains, you really get a lot of these Sierra Madre species like the elegant trogon or the Violet-crowned Hummingbird or that plain-capped starthroat I keep hearing about. Those are pretty common birds in Mexico, but they just reached their northern limit here in southeastern Arizona. And as well as Rocky Mountain species, birds and plants and other animals like the Mount Graham red squirrel on Mount Graham, it only is found as far south as Mount Graham. So it's really this interesting kind of confluence of ecosystems. where it all kind of gets jumbled together and creates really awesome birding conditions for all of us. So if you go to the next slide, this is kind of an elevational gradient that can help put us in perspective. So down at 2,000 feet is Tucson, but the Sky Islands reach as high as 10,000 feet in some places. And so that's an 8,000 foot vertical gain that you have to go through to get from the Tucson Basin to the top of Mount Lemmon or Mount Graham. And so this huge elevational gradient, it's more than you'd see in a lot of the Rocky Mountains, really, in Colorado. You often start out and say like 8,000 feet there and go up to 12,000. Here you're rising 8,000 feet out of the desert. And so along the way, you're going to pass through a number of different ecosystems that are going to have their own specific birds and plants that you can find. And so moving up from Tucson to about 3,000, 4,000 feet, you start to reach the grasslands. Eventually you get to the oak grasslands and the oak woodlands. And then you break into the pine trees and then the mixed conifer forest at the top of these mountains. So along the way, you're going to go through all these different ecosystems over a very short actual literal distance. But in a lot of ways, going from the, say, the Tucson Basin to the top of Mount Lemmon, it's a lot like going from the desert all the way to Canada, because you're going through all these different ecosystems along this huge elevational gradient. So on the left, you can see we have like Mount Lemmon up around 9,000 feet. Flagstaff, where I happen to be sitting right now, and the pine trees is a little over 7,000 feet. Some of the more famous birding destinations in southeastern Arizona, like Madera Canyon, Ramsey Canyon, etc. These places are at around 5,500 to 6,500 feet, depending on where you are in those canyons. And that's in that oak woodland zone, or the Madrean oak woodlands, where you tend to find cuckoos and other, or actually we do find cuckoos. We tend to find trogons, which I meant to say, and some other interesting hummingbird species. Patagonia is a little bit lower than these canyons, and it's at about 4,000 feet. So it's at kind of like this intersection between the desert grassland and the oak grassland. And so it's a really unique location, being in that kind of mid to low elevation range, where it's not too hot, not too cold, and really just right for lots of hummingbirds and other species. And so on the next slide, we'll see, this is satellite imagery of the Sonoita Creek corridor and the Patagonia region. So you can see all the kind of light brown of the mountains to the north and south is just these grasslands and oak woodlands of the Santa Rita Mountains to the north and the Patagonia Mountains to the south. But what you can see is the town of Patagonia, a very small, nice, quaint little town that I love with all my heart. It kind of represents the emergence point of perennial water along Sonoita Creek, which helps feed this green ribbon of life going down towards Patagonia Lake to the southwest. So this greenery between these kind of bare, grassy mountains is really a super biodiverse area. It hosts more biodiversity than most other ecosystems in the Southwest. So these riparian corridors are just incredibly important and also incredibly rare, and increasingly rare as development and water resource use increases in our region. So this is just kind of a broad overview of the Patagonia region. And if we zoom in on the next slide a little bit further, you can see this is just a map of the Paton Center and the Cuckoo Corridor specifically. So the Paton Center is this dark red area, and it is just a small little property, really. It's just a couple acres in size, but it's right on the creek. So it's when you're there, I'm sure many of you have been there, it's just a super lush little property. The lighter red shaded area is the Cuckoo Corridor property, which is connected to the Paton Center property and also follows Sonoita Creek. So this property has been sort of neglected over the past couple of years. And so although it's still a very intact riparian ecosystem, there's a lot of work to be done to kind of boost the ecosystem health of this property. And that's what Tucson Audubon is really taking on. So Carrie will talk about that later, but I just want to show you how important it is to work on habitat restoration and to think about birding in a place that's so close to town. I mean, you can see just to the east is the town of Patagonia. That's downtown Patagonia right there. That's what it looks like. And for me, coming from New England, when I'm in a town like that, like Patagonia, it feels like I'm back in New England. There's towering trees all around. It just feels like a really lush forested landscape, and it feels like there's rare birds hiding around every corner. So it's a really exciting place to work. It's really unique, really special. I feel very grateful to be able to work in this area. The birding is incredible. And so with that, I'm going to let Keith kind of take it from here and tell us about some of those special birds.
So we begin our virtual bird walk at the world famous Tucson Audubon Society Paton Center for Hummingbirds. Typically, when doing a trip like this, I talk about things like chiggers and bringing along enough water, but one of the good things about doing a virtual trip is we don't have to worry about some of those things. The Paton Center for Hummingbirds has recorded over 230 species, including the first cinnamon hummingbird for the United States. It's an amazing number of species for an area that doesn't have a coastline or anything in such a tiny, compact area. We're excited now to be able to introduce the Cuckoo Corridor to birders. We're looking forward to being able to see what kind of Asian surprises pop up along this impressive stretch of Sonoita Creek. We could go to the next slide. We see the Cuckoo Corridor Trail is a loop trail that's 0.4 of a mile long. Its starting point is at the Paton Center, and here we can cross the road and ascend this gentle slope up to the trail proper. Here at this time of year, the dawn course is absolutely impressive. With the onset of the monsoon rains, southeast Arizona becomes a verdant hub of life. And a second wet summer breeding season begins. Returning migrants like buntings, flycatchers, and warblers, really make it interesting here and enliven the whole breeding species cast. Go to the next slide. This is the Abert's towhee, and one of the first species that we might hear and see along the trail. Recent analysis of the mitochondrial genes suggests that this brown towhee, and this towhee and the other brown towhees like the California canyon white-throated are more closely related to melozone ground sparrows than they are to the black and green towhees. As a result, they're now placed in that genus. This is a near endemic species to the United States. We'll listen to a sample of what will become a familiar song if you walk along the corridor here now. Go to the next slide. As Nick had mentioned, we have a lot of species that reach the northern edge of their range here, coming up from the Abert's towhee barely makes it into Mexico. So you can see how limited that range is for that species. Go to the next slide. The corridor provides fuel and habitat for migrant, nesting, and wintering hummingbirds. In our next slide, we'll see a rufous hummingbird. They come through here in each spring and fall, and right now are moving through in pretty good numbers. It's one of 7 hummingbird species that have been recorded here. Very aggressive. If you've ever seen them, they'll chase other birds, like twice the size off feeders. It reaches the northernmost latitude of any hummingbird, nesting all the way up into Alaska and winters as far south as southern Mexico. Go to the next slide. Here's another species that we see here. The Anna's hummingbird has underwent a dramatic range expansion over the 20th century. It's a year-round resident in much of Arizona, and it's the most common hummingbird species in the winter in Patagonia. We'll move on to the next species here. This is gorgeous hummingbird, is a broad-billed hummingbird. It's a male here, very sexually dimorphic, and this is one of the most common species that we see, particularly in the summertime. In the next slide, we see the female. She's sitting here on one of her tiny nests. You can see how different she looks from the male. They're year-round resident in Mexico. In spring and summer, many of them migrate north. And they breed in southeast Arizona and southwest New Mexico. Increasingly, we're finding birds, broad-billed hummingbirds wintering in southeast Arizona. We go on to the next slide. We have one of the stars of the show at the Paton Center, the Violet-crowned Hummingbird. This is the only North American hummingbird that has a snowy white underparts. It has the violet, bluish crown and a red bill. This is the species that put Wally and Marion Paton's home on the birding map in the 1970s. Well, it's easiest to see the feeders at the center, something especially satisfying seeing this dazzling species away from feeders and along the corridor. In addition to hummingbirds, we also have a lot of flycatchers. In this next slide here, we have the northern beardless teranium. It's one of 12 species that have been of flycatchers that have been recorded so far here along the corridor. Enters the U.S. only in southeast Arizona, southwest New Mexico, and South Texas. It's a kind of an unusual flycatcher, as a bill shape and foraging behavior is much more similar of a warbler or a vireo, and it rarely flycatches. Here's a typical vocalization that one would hear. It's often easiest to detect by song. Our next species is another flycatcher. It's a thick-billed kingbird. It's very loud and conspicuous and has a very limited range in the US. Highly sought after birders, and Patagonia area is one of the best areas to see it in the United States. It has a rarely seen yellow crown stripe. Very rarely have ever noticed it. It's usually when they're being a little more aggressive to other species that yellow will pop up. It's often detected first, from a good distance away by its very distinctive vocalizations. Not all flycatchers are subtle plumages like these. The next species that we have here is on the opposite end of the spectrum. It's striking indeed. This is a vermilion flycatcher and breeds here in desert riparian areas with mesquites, willows, and cottonwoods in dry and perennial streams. In breeding season, it performs a spectacular courtship flight. Still one of my favorite birds in southeast Arizona. You can see Tucson Audubon uses it as its logo, and it's the name of our magazine as well. So it's still one of my favorites, and I think it's one of those birds that I'll never just walk by without lifting binoculars. We'll move on to the next species here. Yellow-breasted chat is very vocal and sometimes can be a little bit of a skulker. It's been a taxonomic question for a lot of years. For a time, it was considered a New World warbler. Some thought it was a little bit more like a tanager. Now it's related to icteridae, blackbirds, orioles and stuff, but they put it into a monotypic family similar to icteridae, but they've added an additional I after the R. It doesn't roll off the tongue real well, and it seems like it makes things even just more confusing, but I think it seems fitting to put this bird in its own monotypic genus. Here's an example of a typical song of this, this interesting bird. We'll move on to the next species here. This gorgeous bird is blue grosbeak and is a breeder here. Has a just absolutely massive bill. Typically departs the winter, although the last 2 winters we've had them along the creek here. It eats grass seeds, both native and cultivated, but insects make up a large portion of its diet, including grasshoppers and crickets. Also during cicada emergence, it'll feed pretty heavily on those. So we got the sharp bluebird here. The next bird that we have here is a summer tanager. Absolutely stunning, but sometimes inconspicuous, can be up, higher in the treetops. It's pretty much along riparian areas here in the southwest and breeds here near the Cuckoo Corridor. It has a very familiar robin-like voice. We could hear that now. Grayhawk is another one of those Southeast Arizona specialties with very limited range here in the US. It's very highly sought after. Lizards are their preferred prey. The last time I watched one of these along the Cuckoo Corridor, it was flying off with a lizard that it had just grabbed and was getting chased, oddly enough, by barn swallows, which was kind of fun to watch. This bird is often, noted by its vocalization well before it's seen. This is a pretty common. Another really interesting raptor here we have is the zone-tailed hawk. If you're really fortunate, you might be able to see this bird perform a spectacular courtship display of loops, dives, and rolls. It resembles a turkey vulture at a distance, and there's a big turkey vulture roost near the corridor in the warmer months. Sometimes when their turkey vultures lift off, the zone-tailed hawks will kind of blend in there. So it's always good to kind of watch that lift off, every morning. The lazuli bunting is an absolutely stunning migrant. It's hangs out in area, kind of shrubby habitat that's similar to its breeding area, but they also move, into other surrounding habitats. A few of these birds winter here every year as well. We go from buntings to sparrows. There's about 10 species of sparrows that have visited here during migration and winter, and also that breed. White-crowned sparrow is one of the most common and abundant in the wintertime, followed by chipping and brewer sparrows. Rufous-winged sparrows like this one, it's another Southeast Arizona specialty that barely enters the US here in Southeast Arizona, and stragglers make it now, are spreading eastward into southwestern New Mexico. This bird breeds in the area. We'll move on to the next one. So we have berries here. In addition to the sparrows like we had before, we also see migrant vireos, warblers, tanagers, and grosbeaks. Berry-eating birds like these waxwings and bluebirds and robins are also attracted to 4 species of berry-bearing plants. While the unofficial bird list for the corridor is under 100 species, we expect that to continue to grow as more birders discover this area, and the birds, as they're prone to do, find great habitat. There have been so many habitat improvements since Tucson Audubon first started working here and then took ownership of this property. From here, I'll turn this over to Carrie, who will provide a lot more information on this ongoing endeavor.
Thanks, Keith. I would like to begin by defining what it is that we do, because not all chapters are actively taking on restoration work, but we've been doing it for 20 years. So there's many different primary objectives when restoring ecosystems functions. So sometimes people are trying to restore pollinating functions as a socioeconomic endeavor. In our case, it's biological systems. So ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And then for us, our primary objective is birds, since we're the Audubon Society. So habitat restoration seeks to repair areas that have been subjected to habitat destruction. And then as soon as we acquired the Paton Center in 2014, we noticed that the area was pretty heavily degraded. And so we began work there right away. In 2016 is when we started the bulk of our work throughout the corridor, because that property was owned by the Nature Conservancy. So we had to form some partnerships there. So the area we're talking about primarily today is the Cuckoo Corridor. And for the next slide, you will see what it looked like when we first started. It was just this complete monoculture of Johnsongrass. Johnsongrass is a native to Asia and North Africa. It was introduced for forage and erosion control. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's common throughout the United States, especially in the Midwest. It is a noxious weed in 19 states. But the reason it's an issue, as you can see, is it's just this monoculture, and it forms these really dense mats of surface level vegetation that precludes the recruitment of native riparian trees by shading out or preventing germination, by outcompeting the seedlings for water. And they're also allelopathic, which means they actually produce biochemicals that inhibit the germination or growth of other species. So it is not a nice plant. So we have several different phases for our restoration efforts. Next slide, please. All right, so first step we took was to completely mow down all the Johnsongrass. We use what's called an integrated weed management approach for eradicating invasives. So we're trying to use the least toxic methods possible, but they still have to be effective. So we mowed it, we applied some chemical controls, but to this day, our primary method for removal is manual removal. And this has been possible due to the overwhelming volunteer support that we've had. In 4 years, from 2016 to 2019, we've had volunteers log over 2,000 hours of support. So they have been huge in contributing to our efforts. So we are grateful to them. On the next phase, on the next slide, the second phase of our effort is to start planting. This is the fun part. So we have our reference ecosystem. This is what the area would have looked like without degradation. Sometimes this is imagined, but in this case, we were able to look to intact floodplain ecosystems nearby and use that as a benchmark for our restoration efforts. So nearby, we found grasslands that were dominated by Big Sacaton. They're very important in flood zones with their ability to absorb flood flows and control soil depositions. Unfortunately, across the regions, these grasslands occupy less than 5% of their original distribution. So we're happy to be bringing them back. So to date, we have planted over 1,600 Sacaton grasses, largely due to volunteer events. We have a lot of these grasses we have managed to salvage from properties that were either sold to the mines and they were about to pave over the land. So we went in and we salvaged those grasses and we took them back to our property. Other areas, they were transforming the land to land for grazing cattle. So we salvaged them from there as well. And then our wonderful restoration partners in the community also allowed us to come in and take half of a plant. So we left half there for them and we took half for ourselves and we planted it and it worked great. So we usually do this in the winter when the plants are dormant and we've had a lot of success. On the next slide, if you come to our property, and we hope you do, you'll see outside the fence boundaries, you'll see the monocrop of Johnsongrass still exists. And so we are very much worried about a secondary invasion. So what we did is we took these Sacaton grasses and we made sort of our own version of a border wall, and a much more environmentally friendly one. And so this is designed to trap out Johnsongrass seeds that could come on site. Hopefully it'll catch them there and they won't reinvade our property. So one of the fun thing about what we do is that we're here to restore habitat for birds. And in this case, our target species was the yellow-billed cuckoo. As soon as you start bringing native plants on site, you're doing that work. But we were able to fine tune it a little bit more by planting walnut trees. The next slide. So you'll see, we kind of work backwards is how our system works. So you'll see in the cuckoo, he is eating one of his favorite foods, tent caterpillars. So we were interested in bringing tent caterpillars on site. So we brought in Arizona black walnut trees, which serves as a larval host for tent caterpillars. So we seeded over 200 of these. Restoration is a fairly young field. So unfortunately, a lot of those were eaten by other critters, but we did bring in nursery trees, over 30 of them, and that has been pretty successful. Other plants that we've planted for wildlife include black cherry. This tree is a fantastic pollinator tree, larval host to many caterpillars. We take pollinator services into consideration with our restoration efforts, but they're also great little snacks for birds, all those caterpillars. But this also produces lots of fruits to be enjoyed by woodpeckers, sparrows, tanagers, orioles, and cedar waxwings. One of my favorite plants in the corridor is golden currant. This is one of the first things to bloom in the spring. It has these nice long tubular flowers that attracts hummingbirds. Covered in pollinators, and then later in the season, there's plenty of berries for birds like the hooded oriole. And then lastly, our main goal is just to pack the site with a variety of food and to create this rich biodiverse habitat for a number of birds. So these are some of the other great plants we've included for that. To us, successful habitat restoration means that we're able to support populations of breeding birds.
What a great job to have.
So on the next slide, here's our yellow-billed cuckoo. We want to make sure that we have their preferred sources for nesting. So we have several Netleaf Hackberries on site and that we've planted. They have a nice intricate branch structure that is perfect for a nice secure nest. A few other trees that are great in the area, the velvet mesquite. So as the floodplains transition to higher elevations, we get these mesquite bosques. Bosque is Spanish for woodland. And they are great for our lovely Lucy warblers. Hi, Olia. And we're not ashamed to cheat, install nest boxes because we can. And then one of the last plants I want to talk about is the Fremont Cottonwood. This one is a very important tree on our site. It's important breeding, nesting site for the greyhawk and many other migratory birds, but also it's just an indicator of the general riparian health of the area. We haven't been able to plant any more trees of this type on site because our water table is so low from ground pumping. Cottonwoods are being lost drastically across Southeast Arizona. When that happens, you're losing a lot of shade, the plant community changes, a lot of non-natives move in. I could imagine that this is how our invasion started on the Cuckoo Corridor, but I wasn't around then. So yeah, we're really hoping to restore those natural systems, improve groundwater infiltration, and support the cottonwoods that do still exist. And then we love birds, but we love bats too. And this is taking our work to a more regional scale. We are concerned about the populations of the lesser long-nosed bats. So we've planted a number of agaves on site and installed a nest box. These are an important pollinator for saguaros, which are a keystone species of cacti in our area, and it's critical nesting habitat for many native birds. So we're just trying to think regionally and keep all of our conservation issues in mind and help wherever we can. And for some good news, in December of 2019, the area that we were restoring that was owned by Nature Conservancy, it's officially a part of the Paton Center. So our goal since then has been making it enjoyable for all of you to come visit someday. The Dirtbags are a wonderful group in Patagonia, Arizona who do trail building. They have constructed a really nice trail for you to come and check out. And then here is a little map of the trail. It's about a 0.4 mile long trail. It's pretty flat. If you can make it up the hill to start, you're in good shape. And then I would like to just finish with a little time-lapse video that we've made. We've done some photo monitoring over the years, and we've compiled it into this little video. I can go ahead and play it. I just want you to see how we've transformed the habitat. While we still have work to do on the corridor, we're currently seeking funding to extend our efforts into the rest of Sonoita Creek. We have done work on 5 acres of land thus far, and we have identified another 170 acres in need of restoration. And so we are hoping to continue our efforts to restore Sonoita Creek for the benefit of birds and people.
All right. Thanks, Carrie. So some of you might be wondering why it's called the Cuckoo Corridor when it's part of the Paton Center for Hummingbirds. I know cuckoos aren't hummingbirds, but as Carrie mentioned, they were the target species for the restoration work going on this property. And so I just want to talk to you a little bit about yellow-billed cuckoos, and I'll give you a brief overview of my research, which is really research that is, like I said, collaborative with lots of folks in the community, including Tucson Audubon and many other partners. So yellow-billed cuckoos are a neotropical migrant bird. So they spend their summers up here in North America. They winter down in South America. And some of my colleagues with the Southern Sierra Research Station are doing some really interesting migratory studies to see exactly where they go in South America. But here in North America, they're pretty common in the east, along the Mississippi River corridors, all the way up into southern New England. And that's because the habitat out there, if you're in the east right now, you probably know it's hot and muggy and humid, and there's plenty of insects around for them to munch on. In the west, it's a very different story. It's arid, it's dry, it's a desert, pretty much from the Rockies all the way to the California coast. So cuckoos out here can only really survive in riparian areas and other areas that are especially humid and productive. And so here in Arizona specifically, we have them breeding in the monsoon season, which we're in the middle of right now. Believe it or not, up here in Flagstaff, we've had almost no monsoon, but it seems like down in Tucson and Patagonia, it hasn't been too bad. So monsoon lasts from mid-June through early September, and that's when the desert really comes to life in a big way. And so cuckoos take advantage of that by breeding along these riparian corridors in the monsoon season when it's at its most lush. And so that's kind of why we call it the Cuckoo Corridor, because these riparian habitats are really at risk of being lost throughout our region and throughout the West. In Arizona, we only have about 5 to 10% of our historic riparian areas remaining in the entire state. So, keeping what we have and restoring what has been lost is hugely important for cuckoos and other species. And cuckoos in particular are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The Western population of cuckoos, we call it the distinct population segment because they're not quite a subspecies, but they are a distinct population. They were listed in 2014, and to the right you can see this range map showing the historic range of cuckoos going all the way up into British Columbia and throughout the West. And that doesn't mean they were everywhere in the West, but everywhere there was water, they were pretty much there. And today we have very few populations remaining along the Rio Grande, the Gila River, Sonoita Creek, San Pedro River. And actually this map to the right is actually a little bit outdated because some of those California populations are actually not even there anymore. So, so like what Carrie has been saying, restoring habitat is really key to recovery of species that are at risk of being lost and also just ecosystems generally. So we'll go to the next slide. And I'll tell you a little bit about my research. I am working on a few questions related to yellow-billed cuckoos in southeastern Arizona specifically. So as I mentioned, it's a species that is widespread, or at least historically widespread, throughout the West, but we know that southeastern Arizona is really a hot spot for their remaining populations. So a few of my questions are cuckoos breeding in upland drainages, meaning are they breeding also away from these major riparian areas and up in some of these canyons like Ramsey Canyon or Madera Canyon, or any number of other canyons up in these mountains? And another question is, where in our region are the cuckoos breeding? So we know they're common along Sonoita Creek, or at least they're somewhat common along Sonoita Creek and San Pedro River. But more broadly, what's their distribution in southeastern Arizona, especially if they are breeding in the mountains? What is that distribution? And then finally, how can we improve monitoring methods for the species? So it is a listed species, which means there's a lot of energy and effort being put into effective monitoring so that we can then make management plans that will help recover the species. There are standardized protocols for surveying cuckoos that have been developed over the past several decades, but technology has been improving a great deal, and these protocols that we have now are very time intensive. And so there's some new technologies such as acoustic monitoring, which might save a lot of time in the field and yield some pretty interesting results. So I'll get into a little bit of each of these just to give you a quick overview. So if you look at this slide, it's another satellite imagery. In case you haven't noticed, I love satellite imagery. I'm a map nerd. So here's Patagonia down in the bottom, and up top here in this circle is the wildlife corridor, which is actually a separate privately owned property owned by Borderland Restoration, L3C. So it's a nonprofit owned but privately owned property similar to the Cuckoo Corridor, but it's in these upland foothill drainages of Sonoita Creek. So you can see just to the east of this circle is the Sonoita Creek drainage going from the north to the south of Patagonia. But here in this western wildlife corridor property, it's a bit more drier, it's more xeric, there's no surface water, but we have had cuckoo detections there over the years. So in places like this, we're wondering, well, what are the cuckoos doing there? Are they breeding? Why aren't they breeding down in Sonoita Creek if there's good habitat there? So on the next slide, you can see a picture of what this area looks like. So this is Smith Canyon on the wildlife corridor property. And you can see it's very green, it's very lush. And this is right around this time of year, early August, when the monsoon has made these grasslands lush and green and vibrant. But what you'd see as a difference between this site and, say, the Paton Center or the Cuckoo Corridor is there's no cottonwoods. There's no willow, there's no ash trees. It's mostly oak and some medium-sized hackberries. So it's really a very different ecosystem altogether. And so if cuckoos are breeding in a place like this, it really represents a whole new set of habitats that we need to be looking at in terms of cuckoo monitoring and population just survey generally. So this is a site where we did in fact find a nest and was a huge surprise to us and really opened the doors. So it's kind of like connecting one corridor to another. The Cuckoo Corridor along Sonoita Creek is super important, not only for breeding cuckoos, but also for migratory cuckoos who are moving up and out of these major drainages into smaller side drainages like Smith Canyon here. And so the next slide is just for, to make everyone feel a little happy about baby birds. Here is a little cuckoo nest with a couple of nestlings up in Box Canyon in the Santa Rita Mountains. So you may have heard of the 5-striped sparrows in Box Canyon in the Santa Rita Mountains. Well, there's also cuckoos there. And this nest is in a juniper tree, and it was actually the first nest we've ever found of cuckoos using juniper as a nest tree. So it was a really big deal for us to find cuckoos nesting here. And also they were nesting up on the hillside away from the drainage bottom, which is pretty unique. So not only does it show that they're using a different habitat, it's showing us that they're using the landscape in a different way as well. And so if you've been to Box Canyon, it's kind of like a thorn scrubby kind of place with not a whole lot of canopy cover. So it's very different than these riparian corridors, which is surprising and exciting for me as a biologist. And the next slide, this is a juvenile cuckoo who looks to be probably 10 or 12 days out of the nest. This is O'Donnell Canyon and the Canelo Hills. So the Canelo Hills kind of connect the Huachuca Mountains to the Patagonia Mountains and form part of the headwaters of the Santa Cruz River. And this is actually on the Appleton Whittle Research Ranch, which is owned by Audubon, Arizona, and managed by Audubon, Arizona. And this drainage, it was, again, a very sparsely vegetated drainage with no real major cottonwood vegetation component, but we did find breeding cuckoos here in an oak tree. So again, very surprising and very exciting to find little baby birds. It's kind of my favorite part of my job. And so the next slide is a little bit more satellite imagery for you. This is a map of all of the points where we found nesting cuckoos in southeastern Arizona. So our study mainly focused on the mountain ranges west of the San Pedro River. So that major river going just east of Tucson, you can see it going north-south. That's the San Pedro River. That's world famous for birding. We mainly focus on the mountain ranges west of the San Pedro River. So we found a lot of cuckoos breeding throughout the region. So up north of Tucson in the Catalina Mountains, Tucson Audubon volunteers are actually the ones who found that nest up there. Just south of there is Saguaro National Park, where we found a number of nests there as well. All the way over to the Babaquipri area and the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge, we've been finding nesting birds. And again, the Santa Rita seems to be a very big hotspot, as well as the Patagonias. And we did have one nest over in the Dragoon Mountains to the east that was just an incidental nest found by a volunteer. It wasn't part of our original study, but we definitely take that data when we can get it. So very exciting stuff. We definitely have confirmed that cuckoos are using habitat away from these major riparian areas, which to me means these corridors, like the Cuckoo Corridor and Sonoita Creek more broadly, are extremely important for feeding these birds up the drainages to the mountains. So it's really all about connections here. And then the next slide is really the mystery for us, is what about all these other mountain ranges? You know, we started just west of the San Pedro, but what about the Chiricahuas? What about the Mount Graham area, the Aluro Mountains? There's a lot of terrain here to cover, and I can't possibly do it all on my own, but I would love to get out there and continue looking for cuckoos in these areas. And it was part of the plan this summer, but it turned out that, you know, the world had other plans for us. So really, there's a lot more work to be done. But what we can do with the data we've collected is use all of these points on the map and start to model the habitat. So we have over 50 confirmed territories in these upland drainages. And that allows us to take some variables like canopy cover, species composition, elevation, things like that, and feed it into a statistical model that we can then apply to the rest of the landscape to help us hone our search image to find cuckoos in other drainages and other mountain ranges. And that's a really important management tool because, again, this region is just enormous. There's so many drainages, so many canyons to explore. No birder can do it all on their own, even in a lifetime. So by giving folks like the Forest Service and the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service some management tools to more effectively find cuckoos, then hopefully we can more effectively manage them. And so the next slide is talking about the recorders. So another tool that we have for monitoring cuckoos is bioacoustic recorders or autonomous recording units. So this is one of the units that we deployed. It's about the size of a game camera, and you kind of mount it to a tree in a similar way. And it has two microphones, so it's stereo microphone. And we set these things to record from 4 a.m. to 11 a.m. every single day, although you can set all sorts of different recording schedules. They're not triggered by anything, so they record passively. It's not like when a cuckoo calls, they turn on. You just record passively for whatever schedule you want to record. And then we take all that data at the end of the season and we process it in a program called Kaleidoscope. And that allows us to, it uses really fancy statistics to parse out all of the vocalizations from all of the species that it hears and cluster them based on similarity. And then what you can go and do is manually verify those vocalizations and create like kind of like Shazam, if you've ever heard of that, where you hold up your phone and it tells you what song you're listening to. It's kind of like that, where you can train it to identify cuckoo vocalizations. And that way you can process all of the data without having to listen back to it. And you can just extract all the cuckoo vocalizations and find out when the cuckoos were calling in your field site. And so cuckoos have 4 vocalizations that they most commonly give, and we'll give you some examples of each of them. So the first is the contact call. So we can go ahead and play that one. And so this call, and the spectrogram is to the right. So that's time on the bottom axis and the frequency on the left. And that shows you basically just the spectrogram pattern of the calls. The contact call is most commonly given in the early season, but also just throughout the season generally. And we think it is what it's described as, is cuckoos kind of checking in with each other, especially during the early breeding season when they're really trying to advertise themselves vigorously in their habitat and their territory. The second is the cow call. And that's kind of like the contact call without the introductory notes. And they use this quite a bit throughout the season as well. And we don't really know exactly what the function of this call is yet, but we think it has something to do with communicating with each other on more of a smaller, like from a shorter distance away. They don't usually give this call too vigorously, too loudly. It seems to be a bit more of a subtle communication. And then on the next slide, we have the other 2 calls. So the alarm call. And this call, we think, is exactly what it sounds like. It's an alarm call. It's saying, hey, you're near my nest, you're near my juveniles, and I want, my mate to know we need to be in touch about this because someone's intruding in our territory. And so when I hear this call in the field, I know that I'm probably within 10 or 15 meters of an active nest or a recent fledgling. And so that's when you need to be aware of your surroundings and not disturb the habitat too much, and probably just back away from that area unless you're permitted to be looking for nests. And the final call is the coo call, which hopefully is loud enough to hear. So this call, it's a little bit faint in the presentation, but it's the coo call, and it sounds a lot like some other bird, like a dove. Sounds like a call that a roadrunner gives, and keep in mind roadrunners are cuckoos as well. The coo call, we think, is given only by females when they're ready to mate. So some of my colleagues have done a study on this particular call, and they've looked at birds that are banded where they know the sex of the bird, and every time they've visually observed a bird giving this coo call, it has been a female. So sometimes females will abandon the nest after the eggs hatch and just go off and start giving this coo call and start another nest somewhere else. So again, it's important to know what these different calls represent when you're in the field as a biologist, or when you're monitoring cuckoos with these bioacoustic recorders. It gives you an idea of what they're doing at a site in a particular time. And so the next slide is just a quick little figure showing the 4 different types of calls that we have over the course of the breeding season. So you can see in June, we don't have a whole lot of vocalizations happening, but by July and August, vocalizations really seem to peak. There's a few instances, like you can see, where the coo calls really shoot up into over 400 vocalizations detected in that survey period. The thing about these coo calls is they often just give that call during one particular day, and they'll just call all day with this one call. So that huge spike might just be a few actual call events, whereas cuckoos usually don't call very much or very often at all. And the contact call they'll give maybe once per hour. So anyway, it's just kind of a pretty interesting look at how the cuckoos are vocalizing throughout the season and giving their different types of vocalizations. And so this is vocalizations from 10 different field sites over the course of the entire breeding season, all pooled together. So exciting stuff. The main goal of this recorder study is to develop protocols and methods for actually deploying these for land managers, for nonprofits like Tucson Audubon, where you can deploy these recorders in the field, leave them out there for the whole summer, and then come back at the end of the summer, process that data, and then you can have a really good idea of what the cuckoos were doing in that field site over that summer, and you won't have to go do surveys, you know, every few weeks over the summer. Even though that's really exciting stuff for me and a lot of folks, it can be a real logistical nightmare to coordinate a bunch of surveys. And another really cool thing about these recorders is you have all the birds on the recordings, not just the cuckoos. So you can do so much more of this. It's basically just this treasure trove of data where you can say, okay, we know about the cuckoos, but what about those greyhawks? What were they doing? Or maybe were there any owls on that in that data? Let's find out. So whereas when you're doing a cuckoo survey, you're not typically keeping very close attention to all the other birds. But with this acoustic data, you have a permanent data set that can be mined over and over again by different biologists forever. So really exciting stuff. And finally, the last slide. I just want to say that none of this that I've been able to do would be possible without a huge team of volunteers and collaborators. So this here is a photo of Smith Canyon, where we started. And this is right at the nest site. So I'm standing directly under the nest that was from a previous year. It wasn't an active nest. And these are all these volunteers that we trained to come out and observe cuckoos, to help us with our surveys. And then along the edges of this slide here are all of our different collaborators: Tucson Audubon, Audubon, Arizona, Forest Service, Park Service, the Hummingbird Monitoring Network, which again, cuckoos aren't hummingbirds, but we have so project and super collaborative, just so much more, so much more. So thank all those folks with me and PhD. But yeah, really great community involvement. So I'll pass it on to I think Carrie for our next part.
I think it's actually Howard.
Hi, it's Howard. We lost a little bit of what you said there at the end, Nick. I do want to drop a plug here. We are looking forward to hopefully in September having a longer presentation with Nick on his work, specifically on his studies of upland breeding and connectivity, along with some folks who are doing restoration in Smith Canyon that he mentioned. The folks at Borderlands Restoration are a good operation down here in Patagonia. Let's see if we've got a slide for me. So I just want to do, and I think we're really pushing for time here, really quickly give you a little bit of an overview of where we are and what we're looking at. So the Patagonia area is pretty much in the middle there at the confluence of the two, right about where that red dot is. This is a map of the Sonoita Creek watershed, and you can see Patagonia is pretty much at the heart of it. Large parts of the Sonoita Creek watershed are in peril. There are a lot of folks out there doing ratings and monitoring, and there are a lot of components that are not showing positive signs. Nick and Carrie both mentioned that something on the order of 5% of the original extent of places like Sacaton floodplain communities and Cottonwood, Willow, Gallery forests are left. And I want to emphasize that those areas originally were 1% to 2% of the total land area. So they were rare to begin with, and now they're rare on rare. It's like exponentially rare. The environment you see near the Paton Center that runs from the Paton Center down to Patagonia Lake and into Sonoita Creek Natural Area is, in my opinion, endangered. I don't know how else to put that. And the rest of the watershed is not functioning properly. It's creating problems, lowering water tables, excessive sedimentation and erosion, are creating impairments. I just wanted to briefly show, I stole this diagram from Nick on the elevation range. The little red hash there shows the range just in the Sonoita Creek watershed. It almost encompasses the entire elevation range of the Madrean archipelago. So it's an extremely tight gradient. There's a very active erosion taking place in a lot of places. It's very sensitive and very degraded. Sorry to be a bummer there. Next slide. So if you can see the colors of some of these tributaries to Sonoita Creek, and the red on Sonoita Creek itself are signs of impairment. That's a rating that the EPA and Arizona Department of Environmental Quality use to talk about places where there's water that's not as good as it should be. And these are signs that things are not functioning as well as we'd like. Now you will see a little bit of blue in there, which is great. We want to see more of it. And that's a lot of why Tucson Audubon is partnering with a lot of local stakeholders, local nonprofits. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Do we have a movie? Oh, there we go. So you can see here, this is, I'm just going to let this play in the background. This is Sonoita Creek and the Patons after a 2-inch rain event up the watershed. Rained about 3/4 of an inch at the Paton Center that day, and you can see Sonoita Creek is running bank to bank. So what this is an indicator of is that the uplands are not holding the water as they should. And the plants just can't do the job. There's a graph at the bottom which shows from, I believe, about 1990. This is stream flow, base flow at the Nature Conservancy, just downstream of Paton. You can see a general trend down. So what we're witnessing here is evidence of a very unstable and what we call flashy system, where the landscape can't hold on to the water and it just flushes it all out right away when it hits. And in spite of large flows and large rain events, and we can go to the next slide for the rain, the creek is generally over time lower and lower in its basal stages. I think we have a movie of a rain from the other day. I was taunting some of the folks up in Tucson with this. I was at Paton. We got another 3/4 of an inch. Great rain. The gauge at the bottom, I don't know how many of you know, but Paton Center has been an official Weather Service monitoring site for decades. You can see the rainfall amounts that are pretty consistent. So we're pretty sure that the lowering of the water table and the reduced flows in the creek are not a result of precipitation changes. Now, they could be, to no small degree, a result of a change in the regime of precipitation. In a lot of studies, there's suggestions that we may be losing a lot of our winter rains here, our more gentle rains, and we're being subjected to more violent, less frequent storms, where we get large amounts of water falling down all at once. So that's another concern. Good folks in the area, though, are rallying to the cause. We have partners with TNC, Borderlands, Friends of Sonoita Creek, You can see some of our friends there on the right. They are doing what's known as a rapid stream riparian assessment. We're looking at floodplain health, riparian conditions, fish habitat, canopy cover, all the way from the lowest plant to the tallest tree, looking to give it a rating so that restoration people can make management decisions. This actual site, I believe it's on the Nature Conservancy property. I don't know if everybody knows this, but Tucson Audubon was instrumental in getting the Nature Conservancy property, the Sonoita Creek Preserve, established in the 60s. We worked closely with them. The picture on the left is from a recently released plan. You can see a little bit of the land ownership, some of the stakeholders, and you can see, if you can see, and you can barely see because they're so rare, are the Cottonwood, Willow, and Sacaton floodplain communities, and the little bits of perennial stream that is the 1/10 of 1% that's left. And I just want to mention one thing very quickly. Carrie mentioned reference sites, an area by which the ideal is measured. And we have a guy who does riparian stream assessments out of University of New Mexico. Does a lot of the crank turning, if you will, gives us a lot of the usable data in a form we can digest. And he is one of the creators of the protocol. Down at the end in the lower left, you can see Patagonia Lake. Upstream of there, about halfway to the purple, which is the Circle Z Ranch. One day we're out there minding our own business, doing the riparian stream assessment, and Pete stops. His name's Pete Stacy, Dr. Pete Stacy. He says, "Holy cow, I've never seen this before. This is a reference reef." He's been all over the West, hundreds of sites. He'd never seen a site that actually met the reference, that was actually still as good as it gets. That site's in danger. So we're working hard. Next slide. So our good friends at TNC invited us, along with Borderlands Restoration and the Big Rancher at Circle Z there, to participate in the creation of a watershed conservation plan. This is for the entire watershed that I showed you on the map earlier. I'm going to read you a little blurb here. It's the vision statement for the watershed. The quote is, "We envision a broadly engaged community that invests in and is supported by social and natural environments within the Sonoita Creek watershed, including sustainable nature-based economy." So we're signed on to this. This is a tall order. We have other stakeholders in the area that are working on extractive processes that have a history of creating degradation in the environment. The land's been pounded, but there are a lot of resources that are very valuable, and it's going to be a challenge to make sure that the place that supports the type of environment that allows birds, the willow flycatcher, cuckoo, both listed, the Lucy's warbler, the Swainsons, and greyhawks, the Bell's vireo, the Abert's towhee, all these birds that we really, well, a lot of us travel to see them. I mean, my goodness, they're special, right? So this place is one of the last places that can support those birds. And that's what we're all here to make sure continues. These are some of the stakeholders in the local area. You can see there's some folks there that do all kinds of stuff, good stuff going on. If you want to learn a little bit more about some of the immediate threats locally, there is another Birding with a Purpose presentation taking place in just a little bit, which Keith Camper is going to be a part of, and some of our local friends from the Patagonia Area Resource Alliance, and a couple other friends too. So hope you have a good time.
All right, I know that was a lot. We covered a lot of different scientific fields, so I'm sure we have tons of questions. I just want to thank everyone for coming again and just reiterate what Howard just said, that if this was interesting to you and you want to learn more about what's happening in Sonoita Creek, on Friday, we're going to be specifically talking about mining and those impacts to our birding areas and all of the environment in Sonoita Creek. So I invite you to join us on Friday. It'll be a little bit more of a deep dive on some of these conservation issues that we are working on in this area. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. If we need to come back and look at some slides, we can. I just wanna point out that we have Carrie and Nick's contact information here. We're always looking for volunteers and people to get involved, and if you have some specific questions that we don't cover here today. So let's go ahead and see what questions we have. And I would invite people to keep putting those questions into the chat box. And then if we have time, we might be able to have people raise their hand and ask their question in person as well. But let's start with the chat box questions. So make sure that they're in there. And Luke, have you been following that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I've been trying to follow it. You guys, this is awesome. Thank you so much. One of the questions was current access to the trail. We know the Paton Center for Hummingbirds is closed right now, but is the trail open?
Yeah, and technically it is, but I would really make a plug for people to really, think about the situation that we're in right now. Santa Cruz County, where the town of Patagonia is, has the second highest rate of COVID infections after the Navajo Nation. And these are small towns with a large elderly population. So I would just request that people really take that into consideration. If you are going to travel down there, try to avoid interacting with too many people and really following those precautions. And really, I would plug maybe to wait just for a little bit longer, and just make sure that we're really being respectful of Patagonia.
Cool. Thanks. So the western yellow-billed cuckoo, is that considered a subspecies of yellow-billed cuckoo?
Who wants to take that, Nick?
Sure. Yeah, so the western yellow-billed cuckoo used to be considered its own separate species, and then was downgraded to a subspecies designation, and I think the 70s or 80s. And then recently, in the last couple decades, there has been some new genetic evidence suggesting that they're not a separate subspecies at all, but they are a unique population, a distinct population. So as far as the Fish and Wildlife Service goes, they use the distinct population segment as their criteria, or their naming of the western yellow-billed cuckoo population. So it's not a subspecies, it's a distinct population segment, which gets treated much like a subspecies would in terms of conservation and species recovery. So it can be a little muddy to talk about a bird that is actually kind of common more broadly across the continent being threatened, but when a huge when a huge swath of its population is threatened with extinction, then that distinct population is then set aside as a population for conservation action.
Cool. Thanks for the clarification, Nick. That's great. So I was really interested in how we created a kind of a barrier to keep out the Johnsongrass from that second invasion. So that's really cool, Carrie, for you to talk about that a little bit. One of the questions was how is that doing? And then another kind of question related to the restoration is any idea of what it costs to restore an acre?
The big question. So the Sacaton wall, as we like to call it, it was just planted last fall. So the grasses are still very young, but in time they'll all connect, and so it's just a very thick wall. But we haven't had any flows come onto the site since then either, so we haven't really been able to trap or keep track of how it reacts to the flood events. As far as a price amount to restore an acre, we have been applying for grants, so we are able to estimate that it's about $1,000 per acre, given the large amount of volunteer support and our resources for harvesting Sacaton. That's about as cheap as you'll get in the restoration world.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Carrie. I see that, let's see. I see that Pam asked about whether yellow-billed cuckoos occasionally lay their eggs in other birds' nests. That only happens with the cuckoos in the old world in Europe. So thankfully our cuckoos don't. Let's see, just a couple more minutes here that we need to head out. Someone mentioned that it needs to be a hotspot, eBird hotspot, and it's not. So I know someone already emailed eBird, but Keith, maybe you could reach out to some of our reviewers and get them to do that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm going to talk to Andrew Corr about that. Was going to do that earlier before the presentation, but then I thought with everything going on with COVID-19, and that I wanted to kind of like hold off for just a little bit, but it definitely deserves its own eBird hotspot, you know, so we can really start recording discrete, you know, like bird data for, you know, for the area rather than having it just like, you know, kind of lumped in with the Paton Center. So we could really, you know, kind of get birds recorded there. I've been doing my own like walks and I volunteer there the last couple of years, like, you know, would walk the trail and stuff. So I have like, I've recorded so far 86 species myself on that area. And I know that there's been, you know, we're just shy of 100, and I know we'll keep adding species there, but it'd be great to start getting more data points, you know.
Yeah,
separate
that's a good point you bring up. Let's see, Nick, you mentioned Smith Canyon. Is that an accessible spot for us? I've never been there. Someone had a question about accessibility there.
Yeah, Smith Canyon's a wonderful spot. So it's again, it's owned by well, technically it's under management of Wildlife Corridors LLC, which is part of the Borderlands Restoration Network. So they have kind of a few offshoot organizations. Smith Canyon is part of this Wildlife Corridor property, which is was originally going to be a big housing development. So there's roads that go through some of it, and then that kind of fell through. So Borderlands purchased the property with the idea of potentially selling some of the lots for development, but in a much less densely populated way, and then preserving some parts of the property for conservation. So Smith Canyon itself has a trail network, which is really well maintained by the Dirtbag group that also helps with the Paton Center and TNC work. So there's a great little trail network. There's some signage. It's just north of town. So if you're driving south from Sonoita into Patagonia, you'll see a couple signs right before you get to Patagonia for the Wildlife Corridor on the right. And then you can drive up these roads and there's some trail signs. And the trails are a little open and exposed, and you can do like a 1 to 2 mile loop in there. And so just keep in mind, it can be pretty hot. You want to bring some water. It's a little hilly, but not too bad. And just really wonderful grassland birding. And then when you get down into the drainage itself, there's grayhawks, there's Montezuma quail, all sorts of hummingbirds, cool pollinators. And Borderlands Restoration and their partners, Sky Island Alliance and others, are also doing active restoration work there, just like along the Cuckoo Corridor. So it's another really good example of community-minded restoration with wildlife in mind.
Awesome. Well, hey, we're running short on time. Maybe we just take the two folks with their hands raised. What do you think, Nicole?
Yeah, that sounds great. And if you still have unanswered questions, we're saving the chat, so maybe we can just answer some of them in an email later.
All right. let's go to Richard.
Okay, yeah, I just, my impression in the last couple of years visiting Patons a lot in the winter is that the broadbills have pretty much taken over. And they were the majority of the birds in the last year or two, even in wintertime. Am I imagining that, or is that really happening?
Broad-billed hummingbirds have been wintering a lot more in throughout southeast Arizona, Paton Center included. We still have Anna's hummingbirds tend to be just a little bit more, common in the wintertime in Patons, but right now we're seeing, there's probably 80 to 100 broad-billed hummingbirds just in Paton Center area, so they're just swarming here. We get, because they're a permanent resident in Mexico, year-round, but a lot of them migrate not only in spring, but also move up. Some of them, there's a move up in the summertime as well. So in addition to seeing a lot of young broad-billed hummingbirds and, coming up, we'll get like a little bit more of an influx of, like broad-billed hummingbirds coming up to nest here, in southeast Arizona. But it's been interesting over the last decade plus, with the wintering broad-billed hummingbirds. It's been a relatively recent phenomenon.
Awesome, thanks, Keith. And Gary, you have a question.
Yeah, so just the weekend I noticed sulfur-bellied flycatchers in more areas in Madeira Canyon, and I've seen them before. And I'm wondering if this expansion of the neotropicals is because of environmental degradation to the south, or habitat improvement in our area, or we're looking more for this stuff. Any thoughts on that?
I don't know, Keith, you have any thoughts on that?
It's a good question. There has definitely been a lot of degradation of habitat, farther, south or borders. Some of the species like sulfur-bellied have been, around in, southeast Arizona for quite some time, and some areas seem to, be expanding too. So that's a good question. I don't have a 100% answer for every species, but it does seem too that we have been noticing a lot of species moving northward, some potentially related to climate change, habitat degradation.
Yeah. Well,
Cool.
thanks so much. I think, so we'll include Nick and Carrie's email addresses, I think, in the follow-up email, if we could do that, Luke. And then if you guys still have questions, I just want to be respectful of everyone's time here today. But thanks for an amazing conversation. I learned a lot.
Yeah, it was very good. Thank you, Nicole and Keith and Carrie and Nick and Howard. Awesome crew. Great second festival event. And so we hope to see many of you at other events later this week. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I'll send out a recording of this later on today, hopefully. And we'll see you at a future event. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Now, don't we find this interesting that my computer
Gotta work on these kids. You have a year or two to work on them. The other folks are gonna go to wackadoodle. He doesn't want to pay for
Hey,
school.
great job, guys. We'll see you later.
Yeah,
Good
thanks,
job.
Luke.
Yeah.
Thank you.